Future Design Podcast.
Today I've got Prethika Nair, a writer and co-author of Asian Growth Stories, and she's here to talk about the ways by which entrepreneurs can localize their businesses and raise awareness about their brands as they build a presence in Asia. Nowadays, it seems like there's a lot more, globalization that's happened. Obviously, there's cultural differences, but people are more exposed to what's going on, overseas, the Western world, and they're happy to import it, right? So, like in a case like Grab, which is like a similar thing as Lyft or Uber, but they do it much better. Or they did much better than Uber in the end. And why do you think that what do you think was the main difference between the two?
Between Uber and Grab.
The Grab and Uber, yeah, because
Right.
Uber had to sell off their shares.
Yeah. I think it ultimately comes down to localization, right? When Uber came in, they came in very aggressively, looking to expand and to do it in their own way, as opposed to working with regulatory frameworks, which you have a lot of in Asia. So, I mean, I could be wrong, but I think basically what they did wrong was not working in line with these already existing regulatory frameworks. Whereas Grab, for example, they made it very localized. They advertised for locals, they integrated with taxi companies, and that's how they could expand. Even simple things like Uber was cashless, and in a Southeast Asian economy, maybe that's not the best way to go, whereas Grab had cash options. And when Grab was expanding to other countries in Southeast Asia, I felt like Uber was maybe just looking to expand just to get market share in other countries as well, as opposed to actually localizing to suit the markets there. So I think that would have been the main thing that made them fail in Asia. Well,
you do touch on a good point, because it seems like culturally, a lot of the American companies, or maybe Western in that aspect, want to disrupt, right? They want to disrupt industries. They don't care about regulations, or they make it look like they don't care about regulations and try to get in there and then have regulations kind of catch up, right? Whereas, and this is probably a very cultural thing for Asia, people are more afraid of governments, you know, and they would rather stick with governmental rules and then work with the government to expand their business.
For
so
sure.
they always want to, talk to the government and talk about how they can fit in with the local communities or local country and with their rules, and then hand in hand grow their business, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like part of the reason why Uber failed as well is because taxi companies are not going to be happy, right? If you come in there just looking to get as huge of a market share as possible without considering local needs, the fact that you're pushing out a large, group of people who rely on this as their occupation, you have to consider the needs of the people whom you are taking that share away from. So
that's also very considerate too, right?
Yeah,
because
of course,
for Uber, they didn't really care, right? So
they didn't care, but in conservative Asian markets, they're going to look at, people that come in from the outside, like, no, you're coming in and taking my share, I'm not going to stand for this. And they're not going to be very welcoming in that sense. So there was a lot of tension in that aspect, I guess. Whereas for Grab, because they integrated so well with taxi companies here, and it was more about providing safe taxi services for consumers and not just, slashing prices, which is great for consumers, but when you have hundreds of thousands of taxi drivers in one country and it's such a huge part of the economy here, you can't ignore it, right?
Yeah, sure.
So
It creates employment, right?
yeah, exactly.
And working with taxi companies to ensure that they will continue to have a job, whether they work for a taxi company. Because I find that initially when Grab did join hands with the taxi companies, and I asked the taxi drivers, are you actually working for Grab, or does Comfort, the government taxi company, allow you to work for Grab at the same time? It's like, oh, yeah, no problem. We could choose whatever you want to, and that really surprised me.
Exactly, because they had that additional option, right? As opposed to like, these private drivers are coming in, their rides are cheaper, obviously everyone's going to go for them, and then there's a lot of unhappiness surrounding it.
Mm.
Whereas now, I mean, it's not as good for the consumer, obviously, because you get surge pricing and things like that. But ultimately, it's about finding that that middle ground that makes everyone happy. And Grab did very well in that aspect, and Uber didn't.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I sometimes I think maybe for the American countries which are very disruptive and try to create new ideas, but for the rest of maybe even for the rest of the world, do you think that the Asian model would fit more even across Western countries than the other way around?
again, what is the Asian model, right?
Yeah.
Because Asia in itself is huge, and local markets, they all differ hugely. So, what do you mean by an Asian model? Like,
Well, like working with the governments together, as I said, bringing in everybody so that they don't lose a job and they can continue, but also using that technology to enhance their lives.
yeah, for sure, because the infrastructure varies so much in each country. You have to take into account that sort of ecosystem as well, right? You can't just come in expecting the country to be able to adapt to what you're offering. You have to come in and fill in the gap, I feel. So in that sense, yeah, you definitely have to work more with the government because they will be able to understand the needs of their citizens best. I don't think it's a matter of giving in to regulatory frameworks. It's about working with them to provide a service that has not been provided before. That's the best way to go about getting consumers in the first place, right? So
And just taking the taxi business, though, it's such a monopolized business, right? Any country you go, generally, the government definitely has a piece of that business. So taxi itself, or taxi in itself, is a very well, especially let's talk about Singapore. I mean, you can find taxis anywhere, right? So where was that gap? Where was that gap where the government wasn't providing transportation for the people that made Grab or Uber successful initially to take over parts of that taxi business?
I think it's purely just pricing.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's what it worked on, and that's what worked, obviously, for consumers. Because, I mean, Singapore's not exceptionally expensive when it comes to taxis, but it is compared to the rest of Southeast Asia, right? So if you give people more options, they're going to take it anyway, even if it's marginally cheaper.
Or do you think it was like convenience as well? Because, yes, there was an app for the taxis, but it was pretty shitty, right? I mean, and the experience that you get from getting an Uber or Grab, it's pretty seamless.
True.
Every time it gets better. I think their algorithm that makes it much quicker, and they learn the best routes and all that. Whereas
Sure, the user experience is just a lot better, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned about credit card integration. I mean, I had many times here when I got into a cab and they only took cash, or they asked me where I'm going and refused to take me into certain locations. So obviously there were a lot of, for me, I mean, there was a lot of dissatisfaction about the experience where, I think technology just removed that completely when Grab and Uber came in.
Well, that's exactly like what you were saying just now about the gap, right? Because now people have more options, like you said, when you're going out late at night and you're trying to get a cab and they're not going to pick you up because they have a destination in mind. Sometimes you just want to get home and you don't mind paying that extra surcharge just to get home. So at least now you have that option.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the aspects that it provided for people here that wasn't being addressed before. Yeah.
Yeah. And then what about so you said Asian cultures, obviously I know that they're all different, but let's go into specifics. I mean, how are they actually different? So like Indonesia, I'm sure you traveled around everywhere and interviewed all these people in your book and stuff, right? So how are they different?
So
Can you give an example from it could be in comparison with like Gojek to a Grab, or you can choose whatever example that you like. But how do you see certain differences?
yeah, so I think the most important thing to take into account is infrastructure. When you're talking about like Infocom, for example, levels of access to it and levels of development, they're so different in different countries, right? the level of internet access in Singapore is not going to be anywhere near what it is in, in Cambodia, for example.
Sure.
So that plays a large part in the cultures of business around Asia. So, for example, Indonesia actually has a really huge e-commerce market, right? Compared to some place like, you call it emerging economies. So even compared to places like Vietnam, Vietnam's actually up and coming. It's booming now. But again, compared to economies like Cambodia or Myanmar, Indonesia has a significantly larger amount of the population online, shopping online, and things like that. So you have to take this into account when you want to start your business. Like, you could start a business online in Cambodia or Vietnam, but it's not going to be the same as doing it in Indonesia, because when the market's already so saturated, what's going to make you better than everyone else? And then again, that comes into going offline again, right? You start off online, but if you want to engage consumers, you have to go offline. You have to meet the people that you're catering to. How do you get inside their heads? How do you get to know what they want? Things like that. So, for example, one of the people that we interviewed in the Indonesian context, what they did was they were running a small business, but they knew that they had to improve consumer engagement. So what they did was they actually went out on the streets, gave out flyers, old school. No one does that anymore except for and they did promotions where they were like, okay, if you wear our clothes and take pictures of yourself, then we'll give you rewards for it. Things like that. So really getting the people involved and getting to know what they want. And another way of doing that, for example, in the Philippines, there's a huge online presence as well. So many people are on Facebook, on LinkedIn, even professionally speaking, right? Even on LinkedIn. So it's not that difficult to actually get online, find your niche, have conversations with them. Not just observe, but actually have conversations with them, find out what they want, ask them questions and listen to what they want. Whereas that approach might not work in some place like Myanmar, right? So
meaning like they're okay with just email exchange, or you have to do everything offline?
Yeah, exactly. So in some countries, it's okay to just converse online. It's acceptable. Whereas in other places, they would want to meet face to face. They would want that FaceTime. They want that interaction in order for them to trust you, right? I think in a lot of Asian countries, especially, you see that difference in terms of it's a stereotype, right? But they say, like, in the West, you can keep it professional in the office, and then that's where it stays. Whereas in Asia, there's this idea of that, no, you have to take it outside of the office. You have to go for drinks.
Yep.
You have to really get to know each other, and then I'll trust you, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And we used to joke that when I started working in Japan, all the business happened in a smoking room.
Exactly.
And then you have to go out and get hammered.
Yeah.
And then you actually start doing business.
Yeah.
So I used to fake smoking and go downstairs and then mingle with the people, because that's where most of the decisions were actually made, and it was not at the meeting room or in the office.
Exactly.
But I mean, but I'm sure there's like a degree of offline activities that are happening in businesses, right? So in certain cultures, maybe you could give me an example where like you do have to go out and get shit-faced, or some places where it's okay to keep it kind of professional and you don't have to do so much offline stuff. So let's what kind of examples do you have?
So it's tricky, right? I mean, what do these interactions entail outside of the office? How do I come in here and try to win your favor? And that kind of overlaps with issues like corruption and bribery as well. If I bring you on a night out because I want to get to know you better as a client, does it count as bribery if I'm going to pay for all your drinks, right? Some people spend hundreds of dollars in a night just entertaining their clients. Could that be considered bribery? Also, just things like gift giving. So in Cambodia, it's actually from what I've heard, right, it is perfectly acceptable to give gifts to potential clients, and in fact, they expect it. So if you don't do that, then you might not get their business.
Yeah.
And Transparency International actually carried out a study, just perceptions of corruption within countries like Vietnam and Cambodia. And in some of these places, business owners, like maybe as much as 60% of business owners found that they had to give gifts. But obviously this wouldn't fly in a place like
Or
Singapore.
it's like really expensive gifts, or
Yeah, exactly.
like Rolexes
Cars
or
or
really?
just things like that. Yeah.
Right.
I'm not sure about about cash gifts. I'm not really sure. Yeah, but so yeah, how you take it out of the office really matters, right? You don't want to be construed as actually trying to bribe someone if you're not.
Sure.
You can't do that in places like Singapore or Hong Kong where anti-corruption laws are so strict.
Sure.
Yeah. So I think that's the main difference about understanding what is expected of you as someone who's coming into the market and trying to win favor. Yeah.
But do you think that's changing over time? I mean, do you think it's like still an old school thing that older people would expect some kind of an exchange for their business? Do you think younger people are like kind of stepping away from that, or are they actually continuing that tradition?
I think like if that structure is already in place, there will be people who try to make use of it anyway.
Yeah.
What matters is anti-corruption structures in place that would actually enforce rules. So in countries like in China or India, it's too massive. You just can't enforce these regulations, right? How are you gonna keep track of minute transactions that are going on?
And there's always ways to kind of hide it anyway.
For
right?
sure.
Yeah.
And if it's acceptable, so to speak, in certain aspects of society, there will be people to make use of it. Why not, right?
Sure.
Especially if they're going to get away with it. They know they're going to get away with it. So I don't know if it's going to change. I think regulatory frameworks have to change. Anti-corruption laws have to change. It's easy to regulate in small countries like Singapore, right?
For sure.
Hong Kong, yeah. It's so much easier. But, like in India, for example, when Modi, he undertook the demonetization. You have to go through huge steps like that just to try and curb corruption.
Yeah.
Are governments really willing to go that far? Because that's a massive undertaking, not just in terms for business, but also just your citizens in general, right? It's a process that takes months. You don't know what the outcome of it is going to be as well.
Yeah.
People are going to hate you for it.
Sure.
So I don't know if it will change anytime soon.
But even with that demonetization, I mean, did it actually curb bribery and corruption?
It's too soon to say.
Right.
Yeah, it's too soon to say. Also, that money just goes back to the government anyway, right? So it will take a bit of time before we see the effects of that. But basically, everyone had to get rid of their stashes of cash.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
So it remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. But sometimes people view it as like a way to get stuff done. Right? And there's many years. I mean, many countries have been bribing other countries' officials so that it can get things done. Whereas if you do it in a proper channel, you can never get things done. Right. So it's always like like an equilibrium kind of thing. Where it's like, okay, do I bribe this guy to provide great infrastructure for this country, or I don't pay, and then there's nothing for this country, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so maybe it's a more philosophical thing, right? So it's like, does it need to exist, or to make things happen, or is this something that we should completely eradicate so that the country can prosper without this dark money going on?
Yeah. See, because it's philosophical, you have to consider the situations. When you're talking about it on that level, okay, I want to accept this money because I want to see my country prosper, right? But where it actually happens is on a much smaller scale, where it's between people on the streets, right? I don't have the time and money to wait for the papers for my building to get built. Right? I don't have the time to go through all this red tape. It's just easy for me to pay off this guy because he's going to ask for it anyway, and he's going to give me trouble if I don't give him the money. So that's where the mindset has to change. Not so much on an upper scale, but on a day-to-day basis. Yeah, I think that's where it has to change.
Right, because political corruption is everywhere, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if you're a developing country or a developed country. I mean, it's always there. You hear on the news all the time.
Yeah.
Like whatever. Joe Biden's son. Went and the stuff that you've been hearing about Trump. But also, I mean, even the best countries in the world are having corruption.
Yeah.
And sometimes it smoothens out, political tension between two countries in some way. But maybe you're saying that on a day-to-day basis, where if I get caught speeding and I give $100 to the police and I get away with it.
Yeah.
You're saying that needs to be eradicated.
Yeah. What incentive are you giving to the policeman to not accept the bribe? What incentive are you giving to the guy who was speeding to not give the bribe? Right. Well, that's what they say about Singapore, right? That's why our politicians are amongst the most highly paid in the world.
So that's the thing. Like if you go to anywhere, Indonesia, or I've experienced this as well, Malaysia, you get caught speeding or doing something, you pay them off because you know that they're actually not getting paid, right?
Yeah.
They're just really poor. You have to pay them off, and that's how
where
they
make
their
most of
living.
their money.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And which is great. I mean, like, if you see that on a smaller scale, yeah, but then it becomes a lot more sinister when you see how that extends to other aspects of society. For example, human trafficking across borders, right? It's pretty bad because you do see cases of, for example, they found mass graves of Rohingyas who were trying to get across the border from Thailand to Malaysia, that sort of thing, or just people trying to come over for labor purposes. And the ones enabling it are local officers because they're getting paid off for it because they're not getting paid enough, right? So, yeah, we can joke about paying off a speeding ticket, but then it does extend into areas of society that cause so much harm to people, right? The fact that you are trying to curb human trafficking. Well, I think a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, they approach it from more of a border control sort of perspective. They don't want illegal immigrants coming in. But at the end of the day, a lot of people are being exploited for this. And I mean, you heard about the lorry deaths in Essex.
Sure.
Same thing, right? Because people get so much money for it. These people are paying 10,000 to 30,000 pounds just for passage. I think that's what we should be focusing on, as opposed to just small cases of bribery here and there that are going to happen because people want things to get sped up, sure. But where it really counts is in situations like this, I think. Yeah.
Sometimes when I see like these refugees from Syria trying to enter the EU and they get stopped, and there's all this political bullshit that's going on that they don't want to accept them, or they have to be in these detention centers for a long while, where, as you said, the Rohingyas maybe could have bribed the local officials off to cross over the border, right? I mean, so sometimes it looks like there's a beneficial factor for it because it allows people who are actually in like kind of humanitarian situations be relieved because of that.
That's true. So it kind of speaks to the larger structure at work here, right? Why are people having to cross borders in this way anyway? And why are we focusing so much on security and border control as opposed to the socioeconomic factors that push people across these borders in the first place, right? Yeah, no, you're right. It is beneficial in that sense, but also who else does it benefit? It benefits corrupt officers who are basically, making a living off the suffering of all these people trying to get across. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And, I think the thing that it is pulling down a lot of the economies in Southeast Asia are kind of due to these briberies as well, right? So like in India, corruptions are pretty rampant, and there's a lot of red tapes that need to be kind of overcome to do business, or even any political agenda, whether you want to even just build a road or build a dam or something. I mean, so how are we all kind of taking, or these countries taking like baby steps to even make these things better, or are we seeing any material changes that we can foresee in the next 5-10 years that will allow businesses or political agendas to be come into fruition.
For sure. Yeah. I think especially countries like India and China, they're really recognizing the need to provide a conducive business environment, right, for people to come in. So if you see like UN development progress reports over the past couple of years, India and China, they have actually moved up quite a bit in terms of providing a good environment for business. Things like just in terms of regulations or building permits, things like that. They are focusing on these things to open up the market a little bit. You have to, and they're recognizing that. So it is, like you said, baby steps. It will take a long time because you're talking about something on such a huge scale, right? But they are definitely moving in that direction, I would say. Yeah.
I mean, Singapore is probably the most, or the country that's ranked the easiest to do business, right?
Yeah.
But it seems like Singapore always takes the balanced approach where they'll see an industry flourish and then they'll think about regulations or something. So like take the blockchain business that I'm in as well. I mean, crypto trading or blockchain businesses have been pretty available or like open for business in Singapore, and there's been a lot of companies from different countries coming over to Singapore to do blockchain businesses, ICOs or what have you, for quite a long time, and now slowly, Singapore is saying, okay, these are going to be the rules. Where certain countries like outright ban them, like China, India, for cryptos, and Japan, I think, was the first one to regulate crypto exchanges, and then they regulated the heck out of ICO so that nobody would do it, which is probably right. But I mean, I don't think that they gave anybody a chance to even do it properly, right? So, do you think this is like the model that Singapore can showcase to the rest of the world how business can be done?
Whether it's right.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's a right or wrong, but I mean, there's a reason why Singapore has become the country that is easier to do business, right?
But again, like what kind of business?
Yeah, sure. Well, okay, so let's take like technology first. Okay, so new business. Singapore always likes new stuff, right? Or the things that smell like money, and I think that's kind of the way that Singapore has definitely grown. And and can that model be, even in a cultural sense, right? Going back to your cultural differences and all that, but I think Singapore is doing it in their own cultural way to relax certain industries so that it can flourish and see how it can make money, and then decide what they want to do with it. I mean, do you think that's a type of model that countries like Japan or the U.S. or UK or other countries can kind of I don't know, cut and paste and do it, or do you think there's more of a cultural element to it?
I think there's definitely a cultural element to it also because Singapore is so small, and in terms of finite resources, it really focuses on industries that it knows are viable, that will have good returns, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of investment into science and tech for sure because that it's going to do well. People would argue that it could do a lot more for the arts. Should all countries follow this model? I don't know. It depends on what each country finds important in the first place. I don't know. I think it depends on what you hope to achieve at the end of the day, because Singapore relies so much on foreign firms coming in for investment. So that's why it opens up in that sense. Whereas in other countries where they're still focusing on developing their own infrastructure, like India, for example, I don't think they would take such a focused approach into what to invest in because they're not doing much investment in terms of, foreign firms anyway. So it depends on the priorities, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I mean, as you know, Singapore is like run like a business, right? And there's always have to be an ROI for certain things that they do. But, if you're actually using taxpayers' money, shouldn't there be an ROI for things that government, does? I mean, whether it's, building roads and bridges or spending on science and technology or, investing for sports and arts.
Yeah.
I mean, everything has an ROI to it, right?
Yeah, practically speaking, yeah, for sure.
And why can't, if you're spending people's money and putting it into these projects, whatever it is, and there has to be an ROI to it, right?
Yeah, fair enough.
And personally, I think that mindset should be applied to anything that government, whether they're conservative or they're liberal, it doesn't really matter, because ultimately it has to go back to the people, right?
Sure, but then wouldn't there be an extra focus on the STEM industries, right? Because those always have the best returns anyway, and all countries would just end up focusing on that, I feel.
Well, I think it's about allocation, right? Like, let's say, just I'm going to think about it in like an investment kind of way. So you have a portfolio of various industries that you like to grow, sports, arts, technology, science, whatever it is. And, maybe the politicians can get together and say, okay, for the next 5 years, we're going to allocate 20% of these funds to science and tech, and then 10% for sports, whatever it is. I don't care what it is. But the thing is, they should have this kind of approach where, they assign ROIs to each of them, whether it doesn't, it's very hard to quantify ROI in these senses, but, you want to have some kind of economic outcome from doing these things. And then, they pick and choose what it will be. And then each ministry of whoever's like assigned to it can decide within that where that money would go. It could be to stem cell research. It could be, blockchain technologies, whatever it is, and then do that. And it's kind of like what Singapore is doing in some way, right?
Yeah, but also because in these industries, it's so much easier to quantify, right?
Sure.
Especially when it comes to innovation, for example, it's so much more tangible to say that this is going to be the outcome of your investment into this. Whereas you don't have that sort of tangible returns from if you were to invest in the arts or into sports, right?
Well, professional sports, you can actually quantify, right?
Yeah.
So,
but also, if you don't give like enough funding to the arts, who's to know whether a particular filmmaker is going to make it big someday or not, because they don't have the sort of funding that other industries would have. So it is very much a choice. By choosing to focus on these industries, there is going to be a lack of innovation in other areas, and if you're willing to accept that just for the sake of ROI, yeah, I guess for practical reasons it makes sense, but then you are also sort of excluding talent of various other industries as well. So,
well, yeah, especially for Singapore, I think they want something very tangible, actionable, and then keep the people happy that they're getting something for it, and then whether it's culture, art stuff, they can just import it, right? That's kind of easier for them, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously there's a need for a certain amount of budgets allocated for arts, of course, but sometimes I think the foreign countries can actually contribute to that as well. I was watching a Filipino movie on Netflix, and I'm sure no local producer would have the amount of cash to put down a production of a movie than Netflix, compared to Netflix, right? Yeah. So then, actually Netflix was actually contributing to the growth of the movie production industry in Philippines, right? Yeah. And then giving them a platform where international viewers can actually have a chance to watch a Filipino movie. I never watched a Filipino movie before in my life, and I thought it was pretty good. Yeah. So, I think those, that's also a way to kind of allocate capital too, right? Or say, okay, well, we'll bring in this kind of industry so then they can flourish our country,
For sure. But then there's two aspects of that as well, right? Like you said, it's because Netflix did it. So this is a platform that is actively seeking to be quite diverse, right, in the first place. Sure. So it would make sense for them to do it. But why would any other foreign entity invest into the arts of a different country?
Right.
And it should be. I think that onus should be on the government ultimately.
Right.
Yeah.
But I've seen like other, I was on, I guess in the west areas here. There's quite a few. I went to GovTech here, and then it shared the same building as Fox. I think we're like HBO or something. So I was quite amazed, and I was asking our production guy, I was like, why would HBO or Fox want to have an office in
A lot of the
Singapore?
media firms have moved there.
Yeah.
Yeah, from what I know.
But even like overseas ones, I was quite surprised why they would have, like an American
Shares base.
Yeah. It was kind of, I'm sure it's some kind of governmental agreement between or Singapore government with that company to have an office.
Yeah, also
They may
just to
given
have that as
subsidies.
a hub, I guess, for
Yeah.
yeah, they probably got a good deal out of locating their office there
Yeah.
anyway. So
They'll probably hire Singaporeans,
yeah.
and then maybe they could learn how to create like movies and TV dramas and stuff.
True.
Like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there are ways. I mean, but in terms of that's Singapore. But like for the ASEAN countries to kind of make an impact, whether economically or whether it's in the well, I guess politically as well. How do you see them building out their presence within the larger Asian regions? Because it's definitely the youngest region,
Yeah.
right, by age compared to the rest,
Yeah.
and growing population. They skipped several industrial leaps that developed countries experience as well. So what's your view on like the next move for the ASEAN countries?
I think ASEAN in general is focusing on just opening up its borders as much as possible for things like free trade between member nations, and also they are extending it to other countries in the region like China, Japan, India, Australia, right? So they understand that I think it's a two-pronged sort of approach. They need to sort of be the architects of their own economic success. At the same time, they also understand the need to work with other countries in the region. They can't just isolate themselves and be protectionist in that way. But I think within borders, they are trying to open up a lot. They're trying to improve trade flows in terms of data as well, right? They're looking into that. But again, because digitalization varies so much across countries, it's a little bit difficult to integrate compared to the EU, for example, where levels of development are a little bit more on par.
Right.
So it will take time, but I think leaders here are generally very optimistic about working with one another. There is a lot of focus on the ASEAN way, they call it, right? So that is purely diplomatic, how you relate with other countries, how you communicate with them. They're very careful about maintaining cordial relations with one another. And I think that goes a long way in just sort of maintaining stability in the region, right? A lot of people might say it's just fluffy shit on the surface, but actually I think it does go a long way in ensuring that everyone cooperates with each other, and maybe things are not getting done as fast as they could be if they were to actually focus on things like frameworks for trade, or like the South China Sea crisis. They're trying to come up with a code of conduct on how countries should carry themselves in terms of laying claim over these islands and everything. So there are a lot of ideas in place, but even though they're not making much progress, I think as a bloc they're doing really well. You're talking about 600 million people, so it's just a matter of bridging the gap between countries that have not quite caught up economically or in terms of infocom and things like that, which will take time.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I think everyone's looking towards Asia now, right? And Southeast Asia especially. I know they always say that Singapore is a beacon in the region.
Sure.
But I think there's a lot to be said about the capabilities of other countries in the region, especially when talking about young populations, growing levels of infrastructure, rapid rates of development in some countries. I think ASEAN is definitely the place to be, or in Asia in general.
And how are like developed countries like making inroads into ASEAN? So I know, like, from my experience, like Japanese companies have a base in Singapore, and they send usually their best people to Singapore. It's not New York, it's not the UK. I mean, they send generally their elite staff to Singapore, so because ASEAN is the largest growing market for them. It's closer to home, and culturally closer. But what I don't see is like how like a very traditional culture like from Japan would relate to a very young, dynamic population, right? And so it's like maybe you eat rice and like we might like have similar kind of features or whatever, but like but Japanese are much older. And mindset is like more kind of traditional, and they have their own ways that they want to do business. It's not dynamic for sure, right? Whereas here, I feel like everything, you could some countries, they could move fast. Like my experience was like in Vietnam. You go to Vietnam and you could get an MOU quickly done within that meeting. Where I go to Thailand, it takes like several weeks to get things done, and or even one agreement signed off. I mean, so how can these like traditional minded people come into this kind of young region and then kind of get business done?
Right. I think it's understanding what your local market wants, right? It's about understanding what they want at the end of the day, and a lot of people don't know that. They just sort of try to apply a one-size-fits-all approach, especially when it comes to countries outside of Asia coming to trying to move in. And
there is a perception that Asia is all the same, right?
As a block, right? Whereas there's so much nuance to it, like doing business in Asia. I mean, even amongst Asian countries, there's so much difference. Just things like I think a lot of people use the analogy of the business cards, right? How do you present your business card? Depending on which country you're in. In some places you have to give it with both hands. In some places you have to accept it with only your right hand. You don't put it into your pocket. You leave it on the table, or you pretend to read it at least to show respect to the person that's giving it to you. Things like that. So again, that varies from country to country. And even if you are from a traditional society trying to move into a more dynamic one, I think that's only of benefit to you at the end of the day. And if you're willing to do that and adapt, then it's definitely beneficial to you. And it's quite funny that you would say that, actually, because I wouldn't actually consider Singapore to be particularly open-minded in comparison to Japan or anything. I think they're still quite conservative about business practices here.
Sure.
Culturally as well.
Yeah, I don't think it's like kind of super open and you do whatever you want kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely.
No, they're just trying to make it look like it's open so they can attract.
Well, it's good for business.
Yeah.
But culturally, maybe not so much.
I mean, Japan's been like, you try to do anything in Japan, it takes forever, right? So, it already kind of has that perception that it's hard to do business in Japan, language issues, right? I mean, at least Singapore doesn't have that.
That's true. I think that has a huge part to play in it as well. And it's also going to affect how other countries in the region are going to develop economically over the next few years. They say like countries like India, for example, they might reach economic parity with the US by 2030. But what is going to give it an edge over China, for example? Just things like the language barrier. You know, a lot more people speak English in India, and that gives India an edge, even though they're not having the same levels of development that China is right now. But in the long term, that definitely has a part to play. And I think as well, the demographics of where you're going, right? So we're talking about younger populations, for example. In emerging economies in Asia, developing countries tend to have much younger populations than in Singapore or Japan, right? And you have to take that into account when you're trying to break into the markets as well. I mean, millennial marketing, right? How do you change that in accordance to what you're trying to bring into the country? What kind of social media do you focus on? What platforms do you use? Again, there's different platforms in different countries. So you would think it's common sense, but a lot of people just try to cast their net as wide as they can, and they waste a lot of resources doing that, when in fact you should be narrowing down what's the best way to reach your audience. So there's marketing that is very crafted for millennials. How do we create hype around a product before we actually drop it? That wouldn't apply to traditional marketing that you see for older generations in the rest of Asia, right? So Yeah.
Yeah. And I heard like personal branding is very important now. I mean, it's kind of like across, the board, right? It's not specific to ASEAN, but it seems like there's more attachment to, the person itself rather than the product or the company.
For sure, yeah. I think maybe I think in Asia, especially with K-pop and all
Yeah.
of that, right? There's focus on idols and influencers as well. But that applies to anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you're right about personal branding. So a lot of it has moved away from traditional advertising to recruiting people off the streets, or it doesn't have to be someone who's particularly famous, as long as they have a decent following on social media. They're a great way to access a very young market, right? And a lot of people for actually a pretty low cost
Yeah.
compared to traditional media.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, if a lot of businesses are going more and more online, I mean, they
Yeah.
start to lose a face for the company, right? I mean, before you might have a retail, or think about e-commerce. I mean, you go to a shop, and then, it's an auntie that you knew from a long time, and that's why you actually bought it, because if you go to the bigger chain store, it's probably cheaper, but because this auntie,
Yeah.
you still buy some stuff off of her,
Yeah.
right? And then now, as it becomes more and more online, there's actually no human relation to the company whatsoever, and it's
Yeah,
just
for
a
sure.
platform that you just go on, and it's kind of like, in a way, Grab and Uber is as well, right? Because there's no face to this, right? And there's no loyalty to it, other than you might get points, and then you can redeem those points for certain services.
Yeah.
But other than that, there's no personal attachment to
Yeah.
online companies, right? There's
That's
no
true.
loyalty whatsoever. I mean, I don't care if I have a Gojek price that's cheaper than Grab, and I'll go for the price, right? And I mean, you're not gonna be like, oh yeah, I love Grab because I don't know, because I have this loyalty to Grab. Nobody
Yeah.
has that.
Yeah. That's actually one of the things we speak about as well. So how do you maximize consumer engagement when everything's based online these days? Like you said, they don't have that personal touch anymore, right? So some people just talk about things like crafting a user experience. So if they can create a sort of environment where consumers have a good time, or they associate positive feelings with this product, then they are more likely to stick with you. And I think that's the challenge now. How do you reach out to these people if you're purely online? So there has to be a balance of offline interaction as well.
Yeah.
And also, I think consumers are also becoming a bit more discerning about what they see online, right? A lot of people are like, a lot of this influencer stuff is bullshit. And a lot of people know it.
Yeah.
So how do you make sure it's genuine in the first place? It's changing a lot from when it first started off. People would pose with the product and be like, oh, I love this. And people don't buy that anymore. Now they're like,
Right.
no, you have to declare if this is a paid ad or not,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Also, things like buying reviews, people know when it's bullshit. They can
Yeah.
tell. And if they find out that it's fake, then that's it.
Yeah.
Backlash is huge. Like, no, we're not going to trust you anymore.
Right.
So trust is such a huge element of it. That's why I don't think you can rely on just online interaction with your consumers. You have to go offline as well.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because in that book also talks about the trust system.
Yeah.
And the first T is the trust. And the whole system is also called trust. So I think everything right now is that everything that's online, it seems everything looks like it's bullshit, because whether it's fake news or fake reviews,
That's
whatever the
hard.
fuck it is,
Yeah.
you just automatically think everything's probably like made up.
Yeah.
And you just need to find something that you can connect with, that you think it's honest, it's true.
Yeah.
And I guess with the marketing that you do, you need to bring out that trust
Exactly.
more and more.
Exactly.
In the financial industry where I used to work, everybody said integrity.
Yeah.
Like it was freaking cookies, right? I mean, like, and there was absolutely no integrity whatsoever.
Right.
But they just said integrity. You have to show integrity. But actions didn't really show integrity much, and I think it's kind of the same with the online world right now. And it's like they try to show trust and all that stuff, but it's kind of bullshit. And we're always constantly looking for the honesty,
Yeah.
like the true thing.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what we're struggling as a society too.
It
these
is really
days.
difficult because if on a day-to-day basis, we're experiencing a huge disconnect from each other as well, right?
Yeah.
We just text all the time. We don't
Yeah.
remember each other's phone numbers anymore. No one calls each
Yeah.
other. They think you're a weirdo if you call them. They don't call me. I don't want to pick up the
Right.
call.
Right.
So that sort of disconnect obviously translates into business as well.
Mm.
How do you keep people interested when attention spans are so low, right? In terms of your advertising, how do you get your message across in a hard-hitting way? You know, how do you craft it so that you can deliver your message in the shortest time possible? Well, there's two sides of it. Like, you know, if you see all these ads on YouTube, everyone wants to skip them anyway.
Yeah.
You know, they get
Nobody watches
annoyed.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In fact, it creates the opposite effect, right? Like,
Yeah.
I don't want to see another, I'm not going to mention which ads, but, you know,
Yeah.
then you just associate it with annoyance at the end of the day.
Yeah.
So, whereas you have, for example, Thai advertisements, right? Thai advertisements are known for being very
Storytelling.
impactful. Yeah, exactly. So they're long. They tend to be long, but people are engaged. They watch it. They love it. How? You have to be different. You have to be genuine, I feel. Yeah, and the story that you tell. I think that's one of the most important things. Whether it resonates with people or not. Yeah.
And I guess that goes for politicians and politics as well.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, how do you, and especially in this region where, you know, corruption is so rampant, and, you know, you're automatically thinking this guy's, you know, taking bribes everywhere, right? And then how do you actually, you know, cast a vote on somebody that you already know they're probably corrupt anyway, but they still do, right? Like,
Yeah.
well, I'm just taking some new ones that happen outside of this region, but Argentina,
Right.
Macri is out. He was the pro market president of the country, and then they brought in the Peronis back, right? And you know they're corrupt,
Yeah.
right? And why the fuck do you know, elect these people again? And is it because of there's no choice, or is it like, you know, something that they trust in that Peronis style of doing things? I mean, you know, so how does that like kind of, you know, fit in with like, you know, this region as well? I mean, you know that, you know, the things, you know, it's very hard to build trust in this region where you know that there's corruption everywhere, right?
Yeah. So I think it comes down to, I mean, that's why we're regressing towards identity politics, right? Because people don't trust anyone anymore.
Yeah.
So, you know, they see the first guy that sort of relates to what they believe in, you know, even though you know that you should be more liberal, but people are angry. You know, you want to be more protectionist, and that's what they align with these days, whether it's race or religion. It definitely feels like we're regressing because people have just lost trust in the political system. So
Yeah.
they're going to latch on to the one person that represents these values that don't actually necessarily hold a place in society anymore, right? Why are you focusing on things like religion? How does that help your country? I think that it's just anger in the fact that systems haven't worked and people have not been given a voice, and now they have because of the internet, right? Everyone
Yes.
has something to say.
And they have more information as
They
well.
have more information that they want to see. You know, they're not going to see all sides of it. Because of algorithms or whatever, you're only going to see what you
Yeah.
believe in as well. So it's just like a feedback loop, right? And that sort of fuels this anger or just that preference. You don't really see alternative viewpoints anymore, I feel. Especially where you have such huge populations that are on social media platforms like Facebook, right? In Myanmar, for example, populations only really started to get online recently because prior to that, phones and SIM cards were really expensive. So I actually lived there for a year when I was teaching there. This is like back in 2012. I didn't even have a cell phone
Right.
because it cost like 300 USD for a SIM card. So I just
Wow.
made do without it. Whereas now, in such a short span of time, everyone has access to a cell phone. So from what I've heard, basically people equate Facebook to the internet,
Yeah.
right?
That's
so
where I
everything,
get everything, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's where you get everything, and you trust everything that you see, even though it might not be true. You don't really. People aren't educated or taught. I mean, people aren't taught to search for alternative viewpoints, alternative sources of information. So there should be some sort of education about internet usage, right? And if it's not taught in school, and everyone's just given a cell phone, and they start to use it that way, so it becomes a very narrow-minded sort of access to information. Yeah,
and could swing politics as well.
for sure.
And that's kind of like where the for me, like the future of like how politics is going to look like is going to be targeted groupings
Yeah.
of people, and how do you arouse a certain demographic, certain class to be on your side, and then target the fuck out of them, not through general channels like the TV, but like Facebook and Twitter and all these things, so that it could get to
because it's been proven to work, right? I think like even in the Pentagon, there's a unit, I can't remember what it's called exactly, but they specifically focus on like memes during the election. In the previous election, how were memes used by Russian infiltrators or whatever to incite hatred against Clinton, things like that. We can laugh about it now, but again, it's used for much worse purposes, like in Myanmar, when they found out that a lot of military officials were going on Facebook or social media platforms spreading anti-Rohingya propaganda, and this resulted in a lot of mass murders, rapes, things like that. All of it was incited by fake accounts from the military, in fact.
Yeah.
So it's definitely changing not just politics, but race relations, or how people within one country relate to each other as well. So it's terrifying when you think about it, how easily people can be manipulated. Yeah.
And in a very multi-ethnic region like ASEAN, right? Even if you're, let's say, Thai, there's so many different Thais within the country, or there's, I forgot how many regions there are in Myanmar, but there's very different regions. They all speak a different language. Or India, for that matter, where you have so many.
dialects.
And how do you because it's kind of easier when everybody speaks the language, and you could target it and you can kind of manipulate. But like in these regions, I mean, it's hard to rouse the whole entire population when they come from a different religious or ethnic background. And how do you think these targeted marketing of like politics can work?
That's a bit tricky, because I think it comes down to appealing to the majority, but not in a very overt sort of way, right? I mean, in India, it's everyone says that the current ruling party, they're all Hindu nationalists, so obviously they appeal to the majority of the population. But sometimes it doesn't have to be so overt. Like in the case of Trump, he doesn't necessarily speak about the fact that he's a Christian, but he definitely appeals to the people. These are the people that vote for him, right? So definitely it's about just subtly manipulating that sort of aspect and relating or reaching out to the majority vote. Yeah.
All right. Kind of finding that common denominator for certain groups. I mean, I'm sure people in the Midwest and the U.S. are Christian, but they don't vote for Trump because he's Christian, right? I mean, maybe that's a small factor, but they also voice out the anger that they experience because most of them fly by countries, and they don't really get any say in the national politics.
They haven't been given representation before, so now you have someone that kind of aligns with what they feel as well, right? So
interesting. You could talk about this trust system as well, right? I briefly touched on it, but it starts with the trust. And then you have relationships, up close, shake up talent.
Yeah, so, I mean, basically why Joe wanted to write the book was he felt like there wasn't really a guide on actually doing business in Asia, right? Theoretically, you know what you're supposed to do, right? But there were no actual case studies to go by. People have come here, they've done it, they've made it. So that's why he wanted to do this. And I was working with him previously I come from a more political background, right? Where I was writing articles for the local university, things like that. That's when I was working with him, and so he had done a lot of interviews for, websites like Forbes, and he's like, "Look, I have all this information that I want to sort of synthesize and put together into a book to help people who want to do business in Asia. And since you sort of have the political and socioeconomic context, can you help me sort of put it together and contextualize it?" So that's how it came about. And we were wondering how to structure it, because you can't just throw a bunch of case studies into a book, right? And we decided to come out with this trust system. And like I said, it's called the trust system, and the first element of it is T for trust. And that's what is the base of everything else that comes forward later, right? So when you're talking about trust, you're thinking about not just how to develop trust with your consumer, but also relationships in the country that you're in. So when Joe first came to Asia, he started off in China, and he was like, I have all these qualifications, but I don't have the connections, and how do I make these connections? And even in Singapore as well, how do you get a job if you're coming here from overseas? How do you make these connections? And we talk a bit about that, just things like, especially for business, how do you build the right relationships with the media, with peers, even if you want to do collaborations and things like that. And then we also go on to how important it is to localize in terms of getting up close with the population, understanding their needs, understanding where there is a gap in the market that you can come in. And then I guess it's really about not just coming in aggressively and looking to get a share of the pie, right? We wanted to really reinforce the fact that you have to understand your host country if you want to be successful, if you want to be trusted. A lot of people make the mistake of just coming in, following a certain model and thinking that it's going to work without getting to know its host country. Like we were talking about Uber and Grab, what's the difference, right? So I think that's where the book came from. That's what we had in mind when we put the system together. And
And then how did your political background help in writing this book?
I think for me, what really matters is representation. So you can't just come in here and expect people to work for you without understanding what it's like. This is going off tangent a bit. One of my own personal interests is, for example, like labor, right? Labor in a country, that labor conditions in countries like Cambodia, Vietnam, they can be quite atrocious, right? There's a lot of exploitation going on.
Sure.
So you as a business, if you're going in, are you doing anything to help that? Are you making it worse? So I think it's a lot about being conscious of what you're doing as well as an entity, whether you're making things worse or whether you're actually bettering the society that you're in. I think that's a very important thing that I would like to sort of, spark awareness about as well. Yeah.
And can you talk about the other RUST?
Oh yeah. So we talked about trust, relationships, up close, getting to understand your consumer base, and then it's shake up. So shake up, what we mean is basically do things differently, right? Or find a niche that hasn't been addressed before. So it can be, you really have to sort of survey your market, see where you can come in. And again, this is a process that involves talking to people, understanding what they need, what they want, and addressing it. It's not just about what you want to achieve when you come into a place. This even goes for like personal relationships. So Joe talks about this a bit. And he's like, if you want to attend trade shows, for example, you want to be a speaker at these trade shows, you want to be, a lot of people go with the approach that, listen to me, I have a lot to say, I have good things to say. But in reality, you should be talking to these organizers and saying, look, this is how I can help you with this.
Yeah.
Right? So the same approach to the market as a whole. How can I help you? How can I address your needs?
Yeah.
I think that's a really good way of going about it. One of the case studies that we talk about is a fashion brand called Lily Selb, right? And basically started by these two girls. They were interested in modest wear for Muslim girls, right? You're talking about a huge portion of the population, not just in Singapore, but extending to the rest of Southeast Asia as well. And there's so much to explore that hasn't really been explored because it's so niche.
Yeah.
Right.
What is modest wear?
Modest wear is basically clothing that is appropriate for Muslims, right? So, things like the hijab, people are taking a greater interest in the fashion aspect of it, right? And you see that with big brands as well. Like Nike has a pro hijab wear sort of line now, and people are coming. Yeah. So people are coming in, to bank on that as well. But on a smaller scale, they identified something that wasn't really being addressed. There are not enough online stores, for example. You have like thousands of them, right? But no one was actually addressing or providing that sort of thing. So that's one of the examples.
It was like a modern version of a modest wear, right?
Kind
that they were
of.
trying to
Yeah,
create, not like the traditional stuff.
No, not the traditional stuff.
Yeah.
Also, featuring local up-and-coming designers. Also engaging people who are not just influencers, but friends of theirs who had a decent following in the community. So people can relate to it and be like, hey, I know this person. That's something that I would like to wear, right? So just making it relatable, I guess, because I'm sure it's been addressed before, yeah, sure, but not with the platforms that we have right now, right? So that's one example. And also, we talk about other things as well, and just really how to get inside the minds of people, how to make an emotional impact as opposed to just being practical about everything, right? Yeah. And then the last aspect of the trust system is talent, of course. So, I mean, I think that speaks for itself. If you want to have a successful business, you have to groom a great team. How do you go about doing that, especially in Asia? Right? How do you source the right talent? How do you go about HR issues that would be different here compared to the West? So that's how.
How are they different?
Just things like there is a lot. The gig economy doesn't work the same here.
Okay.
Right. A lot of people they engage, for example, Vietnamese graphic designers because there's a huge market for that. But then again, they underpay them compared to people that they would here in Singapore, for example.
Okay.
So just being conscious of these things. Also, there's a huge shift towards taking into account the needs of your employees as well. In traditional Asian working culture, there's a very hierarchical sort of way about doing, even in Japan, right? It's always about just listening to what your boss says. He does it, you do it, and you're good. But now there's a lot more, focus on like things like, I guess it comes to startup culture as well, right? Things like onboarding. Are you a right fit for this company? What can we do for you as well so that you're happy and you want to stay on? Yeah. So there's a huge shift towards that employee welfare and how that changes their productivity as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I've experienced here is that people follow orders very well, but when it comes to providing opinions or ideas, and it takes a little bit of time for them to warm up to the idea that they can actually confront me with an opposing idea, right? And that I guess is kind of you don't really see that much in this culture, and you just see a bit more, and I think it has to do with more of the relationship that you build with your bosses, right? If you're like top down, the way that you do your management style is I'm the boss, do what I say kind of thing. Whereas, I think, certain American businesses are starting to become a bit more flat, and it makes they grow an environment, they grow the people so that it's okay to, be opinionated and throw ideas out, and that, and of course, I mean, boss is not the smartest person in the world, right? I mean, my view is the boss hires smart people than him or
Yep.
her,
Yeah.
so that it contributes much greater to the whole, like business, right? So I think that mindset still needs to like kind of occur here is
Yeah.
kind of what I'm feeling.
Yeah, so I think that's where it's changing as well, because now people are a lot more aware of the fact that they can easily just jump between jobs, right?
When I look at LinkedIn these days, I don't see people working more than a year in one
Exactly.
company, right?
Exactly.
And they're like, oh, several months here, several months there.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that something that I should be, comfortable with now, or because to me, like, if you're only working for a couple months in a company, that's
Yeah.
like an intern, right? I mean, that's not a real job. You don't even get the whole flavor of the whole,
Yeah, exactly.
business, right? I mean, but is that normal now, or
I
is that
wouldn't
a
say
cultural thing,
I wouldn't say it's normal, but I think it's becoming a bit more acceptable.
right?
Maybe not like 2 months, but I think it is very normal now for people to jump after a year or two, because now the focus has shifted to what can the company do for me,
Yeah.
right? What can they offer me that I'm not getting here?
Mm.
And that's why it's become a lot more flexible, more focused on employee welfare. I mean, I guess you have to be discerning as an employer as well. Look at their experience and be like, no, why is this person shifting jobs every 3
Yeah.
months? No, something might be wrong there. Yeah, but for the most part, people aren't as afraid of longer gaps in their resumes where they freelance or they just do their own thing for a bit. People aren't as afraid of switching jobs every couple of years or so. I don't think people are judged as much based on that these days compared to back then, when they would be like, oh, this person is really loyal to his company because he's been there for 5 years. He must be a good employee, as opposed to whether he's actually good at his work.
Yeah,
or
it's
not.
true. It's
Yeah.
not a true reflection. But, I guess the work process of, like, let's say you're in a sales business and onboarding customer and then being with them through the customer journey, it's not several months, right? I mean, it's years.
Yeah.
And in order to experience the whole cycle of that, you need a certain amount of commitment that you put into your job in order to say, I have experience in X, right? And then you could go to another company and say, mentality wise, I'm freelance,
Yeah.
and but I've done all these things, but to me, if you're just telling me that you only work for 5 months or 7 months in a company, I mean, it doesn't really.
That might not be a good indicator.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think it really. To me, it has nothing to do with like generations, right? I mean, because businesses, yes, are faster now, but but engagement hasn't really changed
For
that
sure.
much, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So how do we like retain talent then, right? So you're saying that you have to give in order to like retain, but at the same time, I need to gain something out of them as
Yeah,
well, right?
yeah.
I'm not just going to pay them extra for keep staying in the company.
Yeah. So I think what's interesting is how employers are taking a lot more time to actually speak to their team. Get to connect with them on a much more personal level. Like one of the people that we spoke to in the book, he speaks about how, like, when his employees come on board, he makes sure he finds out what their personal goals are within the next 2 to 5 years, and whether it's in line with the company's goals, and he checks in on them, every few weeks and months. This might be a bit time consuming if you have a large company, but that's where your HR should come in, or that's where your focus on employee welfare should come in, because if you don't check in with them, they're going to leave anyway. What do you have to offer them that another company can't? So in terms of retaining talent, I think it's very much about connecting on a personal level and saying, like, do your goals align with this? Am I helping you the way you want? Are you happy enough to continue working here? Yeah. But of course, it has to be a give and take. It's not like they don't offer anything to you as well, because that's the whole point. If you hire the best options that you have out there in the market, what can you offer them in return? Yeah.
And do you think there's a cultural difference between various countries within ASEAN when you're employing talent? Because let's say I'm a new business, whether it's a startup or international company wanting to open an office in these regions, and let's say I open one in Thailand and another one in Indonesia. I mean, how would that really differ?
I don't have enough experience to comment on that, but I think it ultimately comes down to the culture that you create within your company and how big it is. and creating the right sort of structure around that.
Mm-hmm.
There's that Asian stereotype that it's not just about how much work you do, it's about the hours that you put in to show that you're actually in the office for a certain amount of time, right?
FaceTime.
Yeah, exactly. Whether you're actually doing work or not is a whole other question.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that mentality sort of still persists a lot, but that's because of old generations that still have that say over whether you're a good employee based on how much time you put in.
Yeah.
But I think that's changing a lot with younger generations. Of course, they're starting to understand that it's about working smart, right?
Sure.
Not just about working hard. If you can be productive in 6 hours compared to 8 hours, I mean, what we know of our regular working days are based off of, old notions of industrialization anyway, right?
Yeah.
Ford and factory workers.
Mm-hmm.
What's
Yeah, well, they'll put in hours, and then their actual, productivity per minute, per hour is very measurable.
exactly.
But now, you're not working in factories. You're now,
Exactly.
doing, a lot of things are a lot more automated now. So it's, we're putting in a lot more creative time in it, and those things can't be measured,
Exactly.
and by the hours that you put into it.
Yeah, exactly. So that has to change, I guess, our notions of productivity, which is great. I mean, you do see it, like a lot of companies are offering more work from home days or flexible working
Yeah.
conditions in general. And
Yeah, I have an employee that doesn't even show up in my office.
as you get shit done.
Yeah, and they get shit done. I actually don't go to work in the morning either. I work from home
Right.
because that's kind of my time that I can, nobody is, interrupting my time, and I can, dedicate, fresh, time in the morning to do something creative or think about things, strategy, whatever. And then in the afternoon, I do like meetings and,
And that just
internal
makes you
stuff.
more innovative and creative in the long run because you sort of have that ability to focus your energies where it matters or how you feel is right. I mean, you can't just expect us to be at the same level of, productivity throughout the day,
it
right?
varies. And that's why sometimes or a lot of the times I go and work out during lunchtime
Yeah.
so that I could kind of,
Have
like
that-
reboost
yeah.
again.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I do encourage everybody to do that
During lunch.
during lunch or whenever it's possible, right?
Yeah.
Because I think, your mind is always can't be at a peak performance at all times, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And I do believe that, you have to do some, whether you want to go for a walk or go to the spa, get your nails done, whatever it is.
You just get out of the office for a bit.
Exactly. Freshen up. Maybe people go for lunch for, for an hour to do, to freshen up. But, I think now you should like coordinate your day based on how you perform the best.
Exactly. So that's where it applies to talent as well, right? Understanding that we're human at the end of the day. We're not just workhorses.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's good that the mindset is changing in that sense, but it's still very much isolated to, startup culture and things like that. So it has to sort of spread out to other industries as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think more and more, international companies going into these different countries with a newer, mindset can change a lot of that.
Oh,
as
yeah,
well,
for sure. Yeah.
right? And then vice versa too.
Yeah.
Right?
Culturally, that's just how it works, right? It diffuses if people are open to it, if they feel like it's better suited to them. Yeah.
And how do you organize your time to work?
Oh, I'm in a full-time job now, so
Yeah. Well, what do you
I
do?
don't mind it so much, but I try to, stick to. I don't stay late at work at all. Even if there's stuff to do, I'll just do it the next day, because I know I'm not going to be productive anyway. So I make sure that even if it's just going home to watch TV, it's better than trying to force yourself. And like you said, I think it's important to go take a walk when you feel like it, refresh your mind a bit. Meditation helps a lot. Yeah, I think the past couple of years, that has helped me a lot. So even if you're stressed out, it's easy to just revert back to a, sort of mental clarity. And you wouldn't have that if you didn't train your mind to do it in the first place. So just taking time each day to focus on these aspects will make the rest of the day a lot easier to deal with, I guess.
Yeah. Is there a specific type of meditation that you do, or a specific time in the day that you do meditations?
I try to do it in the mornings. I usually get up quite early, about 6,
Mm-hmm.
5:36. So squeeze in a workout and some meditation before work. But if not, then even if it's just 10 minutes at lunchtime or before I go to bed,
Mm-hmm.
I feel like the morning is the best time for it. So you start off your day right.
Yeah.
And it honestly genuinely feels like nothing really affects you afterwards because you've already sort of come down to that frequency.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. There's many aspects of this that we could talk more, but yeah, maybe we could talk about it some other time. Yeah. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Future Design Podcast.